This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill.
Do not be afraid. We are now in control of what you hear.
1, 2, 3, testing.
A journey to the far reaches of knowledge and the unknown.
I can't believe I just saw that.
From aliens to angels, conspiracies to cover-ups.
One soul and preeminent power.
From extraterrestrials to exposing the truth.
I'll try and explain as much as I can.
You're listening to Planet X.
You're listening to Planet X.
Planet X. Planet X. Online. On your mobile.
This is the Planet X Network. And stay tuned for the Ben Emlyn-Jones Show. It's coming up next. Welcome to the Ben Emlyn-Jones Show on Planet X Radio. Tune in for all the latest news, views and reviews from the world of government cover-ups, ghosts, UFOs, paranormal investigation, hidden knowledge, forbidden history and archaeology, chemtrails and hospital porters. The date is Wednesday, August the 28th and the time is 8 PM. The Ben Emlyn-Jones Show is now on the air, so stay where you are sitting and do not touch your dials. My name is Ben Emlyn-Jones and I am the host of the Ben Emlyn-Jones Show, and I'm best described... How do I describe myself? I kind of like Jeff Rents without the hair. You got that picture in your head? That's it, yeah. Anyway, anyone who listened to my show last night on Critical Mass Radio, I'm sorry about the big mess up, the technical problems and things like that. I did have to abort the show. It's a long story, but basically, just to avoid anyone panicking, you know, I will be back next week. I'm sure it's just a one-off and I can get it fixed, so sorry about all that. Anyway, we've got an awful lot on tonight's programme, so let us proceed.
You're listening to Planet X.
Planet X, the biggest paranormal show on radio.
Right, well, on the subject of what's got my goat this week, quite a lot actually. Where shall I start? Well, something that's happening today is very, very important to start with, because it's actually 50 years ago today, the 28th of August, 1963, that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood up at a rally in Washington, D.C., and he made this very passionate and poetic speech, whose refrain was, "I have a dream," and he goes on to describe what his dream is. And his dream relates to the fact that in those days, in many parts of the United States, they had a very, very similar racial classification and segregation system to South Africa in the apartheid era. Black people were officially designated as the social inferiors of white people. And this designation took its form in hundreds of different ways, to, you know, having all the worst housing in town, having to use separate toilets that were all dirty and horrible, and the white ones were much nicer, to having to sit at the back of buses, things like that. Understandably, the black people hated this, and there was a backlash against it, and some of this backlash took the form of violence. There were people standing up calling for all-out war and even genocide against the white population in the United States. Now, but into this melting pot of rage emerged a man of peace, a man preaching non-violent resistance, in a very similar way to Mahatma Gandhi had done in India a couple of decades earlier. He was a spiritual man as well as a politician, and he immediately got an audience for his words. Unlike so many others, Martin Luther King understood the simple fact that hatred begets only more hatred, and he always stressed it was important to avoid the temptation of hatred. In 1968 he was shot dead by an even more obvious government conspiracy than that of John F. Kennedy's assassination. But you can get a video of the speech. It's lovely to listen to. It's about 7 minutes. It's on YouTube. Anyway, to mark this occasion, the current US president, Barack Obama, is going to make a speech himself, and he's going to make it from the same spot as Martin Luther King did 50 years ago to the day at this special rally to commemorate the event. It's probably going on by now, actually. By the time you listen to this programme, it will probably be underway. I have to say, I'm disgusted by this, and I consider it an insult to the memory of Martin Luther King. And this is not the first time that Obama has tried to falsely leech off the legacy of Martin Luther King. He was actually inaugurated on Martin Luther King's birthday, and that was not an accident. He did it on purpose. And what he's trying to do is he's trying to associate himself with Martin Luther King, his own identity with King's, in order to gain support. Now Barack Obama, of course, is a black man. He's the same colour as Martin Luther King, but in all other ways they couldn't be more different. Barack Obama is not a man of peace. In fact, he sends drones into Pakistan to mow down innocent bystanders. Far from fighting racism, Obama is best buddies and canoodles regularly at business dinners and other events with people who want to wipe out all natural human races and replace us with genetically modified transhumanist monsters. Less than 500 million of us as well. Martin Luther King comes across as very, very sincere, and you can see he's sincere. He paid an awful price for what he did. Obama sheds crocodile tears, very transparently actually, when he hears about school shootings. Now, I get sick and tired of hearing about America's first black president. It's giving a deluded impression, you see. It's saying, well, Obama has to be an anti-establishment figure just because he's black. And of course, black people have always been on the receiving end of all this abuse for so long, so Obama's obviously on the side of the common man. But God grief, they've got to realise, right? All empires and oppressive regimes have done this, right? All of them. What they do is they fool their conquered subjects by withdrawing overt power, and then they replace it with someone else who's an apparent man of the people. He's one of the conquered people. And they put him into governance instead of one of the empire's own people. But of course, he's a completely controlled puppet. Now, the Roman Empire did this, and the Spanish and British empires did this, and now the American Empire is doing it. It's the oldest trick in the book. And Alex Jones has made a really good film called The Obama Deception that goes into this in more detail. I really do hope Americans are not going to fall for this again. Now, Barack Obama he comes across as this man of the people, but he is a tool of the Illuminati global elite, every bit as much as any other head of government, every bit as much as George Bush. Only I think Obama is far more dangerous than Bush. I wish Bush was still president, I really do, because everyone knew Bush was a brainless maniac, but Obama has this veneer of credibility. And his deceit is actually far more ambitious too, because there's a lot about his personal background which is very obscure. For instance, he has a birth certificate which is a bit questionable, and also the journalists have had trouble trying to track down his old classmates at university. All the people that went to university with him, supposedly, or were there at the time he was, don't seem to remember him. You'd think they'd be all too keen to say, I went to school with the president. Anyway, he's going to go to Washington today. He's going to try and spread his lies even further and even deeper than before. And I just hope he gets booed off stage. Because as I said, if you've got any respect for Martin Luther King, you should be absolutely outraged of what Obama is doing at the moment. Exploiting his memory, insulting his memory.
Get in touch with Planet X. Call, text, email. Find us on Facebook.
Now, there's something else that's happened in the news. It's not something that's got my goat as such, but it's something very sad. It's it's a tragedy. I have to announce, I'm afraid, that Jesse Marcel Jr. has died. Yeah, sorry about that, but he has. He collapsed very suddenly at his home on Sunday, and it looks likely that he's had a heart attack. He was 77 years old, and he leaves behind a family. His daughter Denise, for instance. I'm very, very sorry. Deepest condolences to her and to all his other family and friends. He does have an official website, www.marceljr.com. ep3.com, and you can get all his various videos and interviews there. This is a personal tragedy, of course, that the man has died. It's also the end of an era, because Jesse Marcel Jr. was one of the most important witnesses to the Roswell incident of 1947. He's certainly one of the few remaining still alive, and as I said, he's a very, very important one. Now, most listeners will be familiar, but just in case you're not, I will quickly outline, give you a potted history of the Roswell incident. In July of 1947, something very strange happened. There was a large thunderstorm, and people reported seeing UFOs. A couple of days later, a rancher called Mac Brazel found some wreckage on his ranch in a field, and he called the police, and they brought in an intelligence officer called Major Jesse Marcel Sr., who was Jesse Marcel Jr.'s father, and he investigated. He was an intelligence officer for the 509th Bombardment Group based at Roswell Air Force Base, or Army Airfield, sorry, and became that later on. He retrieved the material found by Mac Brazel. He took it home and showed it to his family, and it included material, very, very strong pieces of tin foil which you could fold up, and they just flopped open again, and they weren't creased. Strange struts with mysterious foreign writing on them. And it was Jesse Marcel Jr. who described this, and still did later on in his life. What it looks likely is that some craft of unknown origin, not of this world, extraterrestrial, actually crashed in Roswell at that time, and what happened was the military moved in, they sealed off the area, and they secretly salvaged the craft, and even, it is said, bodies from the wreckage. And the rest is history, as I say. The government have always denied this. They've come up with various other stories about what the Roswell incident was. It was a weather balloon, it was crash test dummies, it was a missile, it was a rocket, it was a balloon full of children, it was a spy balloon and collecting intelligence. They come up with all kinds of different stories about it, and they change their mind every 5 years or so. So you can't necessarily believe that. But anyway, Jesse Marcel Jr. and as many other people have provided evidence to show that the government are lying, and that the fact of the matter is something of unknown origin did crash in Roswell at that time. Jesse actually grew up. He grew up to become a doctor, and he went and practiced medicine at a hospital. He also joined the US Navy, and then he joined the Montana Army National Guard and trained as a helicopter pilot and combat medic. And as a result, he soon became a flight surgeon, and he carried on working actually long after most doctors would have retired. In 2004, he went and served in the Iraq War at the age of 68, attached to an attack helicopter battalion, and I don't think he ever retired. I think he kept on working, and along with his medical work, he has been an honoured guest at many conferences, UFO, paranormal, conspiratorial conferences. Unfortunately, I never got to meet him in that time, even though I went to many of them myself. But I've always admired him for speaking out about his experience. He's a brave man, and his courage was not in vain. So rest in peace, Jesse Marcel Jr.
From aliens to angels, conspiracies to cover-ups, this is Planet X.
Right, now it's time to talk about Syria. I mean, this is probably the biggest news story at the moment this week. A couple of days ago, there was a very distressing pictures in the news of people being taken to hospital suffering from the effects of what looked like nerve gas. There were hundreds of them, and they had to be moved to a hotel because there were so many. The hospital couldn't cope with them. David Cameron, Barack Obama have come on the news saying how awful it is that the Assad regime used chemical weapons in this war against the rebels, and how there's going to be a military response from the West as a result. Funny thing was, what the funny thing is, though, that the Assad regime actually denies using these chemical weapons. What's more, the rebels deny using them too, and the rebels and the Assad regime are actually in the process of blaming each other. So, well, is it possible that some kind of third party is behind this attack? You might say, a bit odd. I mean, who else could it have been? Well, there's a very, very interesting article has come to light. It's actually an archived article from the Daily Mail online, and it's from the 29th of January of this year, and it reads thus. This was a long time, therefore, before all this kicked off, because we're now in August. It reads this way. The US backed plan to launch chemical weapon attack on Syria and blame it on Assad's regime. Leaked emails from a defense contractor refers to chemical weapons, saying the idea is approved by Washington. Barack Obama issued a warning to the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad that the use of chemical warfare was totally unacceptable. Yet, at the same time, these emails have come out. Leaked emails have allegedly proved that the White House gave the green light to a chemical weapon attack on Syria that could be blamed on Assad's regime, and in turn spur international military action. A report released on Monday contains an email exchange between two senior officials at a British-based contractor called Britam Defence, where a scheme which was, quote, approved by Washington, unquote, is outlined, explaining that Qatar, this is a country close to Syria in the Middle East, would fund rebel forces in Syria and give them chemical weapons. This is very, very interesting indeed. The email was dated the 25th of December 2012 and was sent from Britam's business development director to the company founder. It says, we've got an offer about Syria. Qatar is propose an attractive deal and swear the idea is approved by Washington. We'll have to deliver chemical weapons to Homs. That is a city in Syria. Soviet origin, shell, and we will deploy our Ukrainian personnel and make a video record. This is what they're basically saying is that the Qatari authorities in this country, Qatar, have got in touch with with Washington DC, with the Americans, in order to carry out a chemical weapon attack in Syria, which could then be blamed on Assad. The Qataris have sworn that the idea is approved by Washington. Well, obviously they could be lying, but it wouldn't be hard for Britam to actually find that out. The Britam Defence could write to Washington immediately and say, did you fund it? Did you sanction this or not? Of course, they would reply yes. The emails were actually released by a hacker. Hackers can be quite good sometimes, you know, like with ClimateGate and things like that. And of course Gary McKinnon and people like that. And what they've said is that on the 28th, the day before, the use of chemical warfare was actually raised at a press conference in Washington DC, where a spokesman said that basically was explaining that if Bashar al-Assad used chemical weapons, that would be considered totally unacceptable. The next day, this email came out saying that the Americans appear to be cooperating with authorities in Qatar and this defence contractor, Britam Defences, to actually organise that very thing. So it casts a little bit of suspicion, doesn't it, on what's really going on in that country at the moment. I mean, in the news today we got David Cameron going, you know, he's been saying, on the subject of the Syria crisis, the world should not stand by after the unacceptable use of chemical weapons by the Syrian government. And of course he's talking about sending warships and other hardware down there. There's rumours that British Special Forces are already on the ground in Syria operating. It's starting to look like another 9/11. In other words, this is a false flag attack by the very countries that want, you know, to try and run this war in Syria. It's and of course they're doing it for their own ends. I mean, they need an excuse to do it, and this is the excuse that the Assad regime has attacked its own people with chemical warfare, which of course in all international laws is the most terrible war crime. It's the use of a weapon of mass destruction. Now, the real reasons, probably the real reasons why this, the Western powers are backing these rebels, it's probably something to do with business. Assad probably has refused an IMF loan or something like that, or he's failed to sign a contract for some oil development scheme. Maybe he's planning to set up his own oil companies rather than get BP and Shell and other international companies in there. There's all kinds of reasons why the West would get involved in some war, saying it's for freedom and democracy and human rights, but really, it's about business. That's what it's all about. The Iraq War was all about that. The Afghanistan situation, all about that. Of course, it results in terrible suffering, and I'm going to be talking about Bradley Manning in a minute, which is an example. But they don't care. As I've said before on this program, they are psychopaths. All they care about is business, and that's all. Now, I think it's important to put what's going on in Syria at the moment in perspective with geopolitics in general. It has a lot to do with the various false flag operations that have been carried out on us, the various deceptions in the media, that run on many, many levels and many, many situations, which I can't go into too much detail right now. But one thing that's absolutely certain is that Islam and Muslims are being used. I think they're being exploited. And I think this is going to be very important for some of my listeners, because I'm sure, in fact I know that some of my listeners are Muslims themselves, and they're aware of this. And I feel for you guys, I really do. Because you are being used as bait in the trap. Brian Gerrish actually said something very important. Brian Gerrish, who does the UK column, he said that Muslims are the new Jews. And what he was referring to is how in Nazi Germany, the Jews were used as the bad guys for the bait in the trap there. Hitler attached all his policies to create his regime to this promise to sort out the Jews, and the Jews were labelled as the bad guys everywhere. And I think in this situation, exactly the same is happening, except it's the Muslims. And I mean, you've seen things like it's a big subject, but there's organisations like the English Defence League. Now, this is a new organisation. I think it was only set up in about, I think it was 2011. Since then, it's grown to a massive organisation. They're best known for their very, very noisy and disruptive street protests. But there's a lot of evidence to say that this organisation is run by intelligence agencies, especially Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency, which is it's got its finger in all the other intelligence agencies as well. Now, excuse me. Strangely enough, I mean, we've got a situation here where whenever the English Defence League are demonstrating, usually you'll have a group of other people as well who are often Muslim protesters who come dressed almost as kind of like in a caricature. They have sort of shirt tails and beards and little pillbox hats. They look almost kind of the sort of traditional dress. And the leader of those group, I've said this before, the leader of this group, it's a group which is called Al-Muhajirun. It goes by various other names as well. But the leader is a man called Anjem Chowdhury. And strange thing is, there's a lot of evidence to say that man has links to British intelligence, especially through his work during the Bosnian War. Now suddenly he's coming out on the streets as a radical Islamist. Usually he's setting up protests at the same time as the EDL, usually waving placards saying horrible things like British soldiers rot in hell, or sometimes he burns Remembrance Day poppies and things like this. This organisation, the thing about it is, it doesn't actually do anything else. All it seems to do is it seems to appear whenever there are news cameras around and do something very, very inflammatory. They even protest at the funerals of soldiers. And that's about all they do. So in a sense, they're there for the media. The thing about it is, if Al-Muhajirun has links to intelligence agencies, and the English Defence League also has links to intelligence agencies, what could be, it sounds to me like they're trying to stir up a civil war, these intelligence agencies, by playing both sides. And they've done this before, and it looks like they're going to try and do it again. And as I said, I mean, I don't have the details with me now. I haven't time to go into the details now, but Anjem Choudhury, I mean, he's very, very suspicious. Even in one of the films, he even appears to be wearing a false beard, like it's not even a real beard. You can see the glue glistening on his cheeks, where it's been stuck onto his face. And as I said, he's almost like a character from a bad movie, you know, maybe a Tom Clancy villain or something, you know. He's just so textbook. He's so lacking in any originality. He just comes on TV camera and he says, "Oh, Sharia law for the UK, etc., etc., stoning women and things like this." It's just, the things he said do sound like a very bad movie script. Now, it's a very, very interesting situation here, because if the intelligence agencies behind these radical Muslims, then that has enormous implications for what's going on in the world. Now, I'm not a supporter of the British National Party. I don't admire its leader, Nick Griffin. But I do sometimes listen to what the man says, because very occasionally he comes across some very vital and intriguing information. Unfortunately, he's too narrow-minded to appreciate its significance, but it's amazing the kind of things he blurts out. He went to Syria, you see, a couple of months ago, to report on the civil war, and he came back saying something very interesting. He was explaining how there are many, many different denominations and sects within Islam, and exactly like Christianity, you know, which has Protestants, Catholics, Baptists, and things like that. Islam is the same, and he said that in large parts of the Middle East, I mean, I already knew this from other sources, but he says that people are following a more tolerant and peaceful interpretation of the Holy Quran, of Islamic texts. And in Syria, there's a large number of very sort of tolerant Muslims. Now, what we associate with radical Islam in Britain, which is I think is deliberate, which I'll come to in a minute. You know what I'm talking about: burqas, flogging, beheading, bombing. That's not universal within the Muslim world. It relates to a single sect, and this sect is called Wahhabism, and it's become one of the most powerful. It never used to be, but it is now, thanks to all the funding and promotion it's had from intelligence agencies. That's not a conspiracy theory. During the Cold War, Wahhabism was encouraged in the Middle East. Now, Wahhabism is an interpretation that goes back just a couple of hundred years, whereas Islam itself is over 1,500 years old. It's a common misconception that Wahhabism is basically representative of all of Islam, even though it doesn't make sense when you think about it. I mean, how on earth could belly dancing, for instance, have emerged in the Middle East if all of Islam was like that? Now, the misconception which is spread is not just in organisations like the EDL, and the BNP, unfortunately. Griffin's BNP is a part of this as well, I think. I don't think Griffin is an agent. I think he's not clever enough, but I think his party's being used for this as well. Wahhabism, you see, we've got this idea that Wahhabism is in the UK because it's overflowing because of immigration. We have so many people coming to the country right now that they're bringing Wahhabism into the country that way. But that's actually not the case. A lot of the immigrants from Muslim countries who come into Britain adhere to very many different interpretations of Islam. And it's when they get into Britain and they visit British mosques after they arrive, that's when they come into contact with these radical preachers who, as I've explained, are suspiciously closely related to British intelligence. So that means that the presence of radical Islam in Britain is unrelated to immigration and is an internal problem. But why has it happened and how? I mean, I think we need to know in terms of international politics as well, because as we're all aware, we're fighting a war on terror. We keep reminding ourselves we're fighting a war against these people for the sake of democracy and freedom and regime changes, etc., etc., etc. However, the largest and most powerful Wahhabist state on earth is Saudi Arabia. It's a massive Wahhabist theocracy. It's the very centre of what's going of this whole thing. Yeah, that's a key ally in this war. Now, does that somehow not fit? Because it doesn't make any sense to me. Now, what's the theory is, and what Nick Griffin has come down with wrongly, I think, is that Saudi Arabia are behind this whole thing. They're sending their Wahhabists into Britain using organisations like the Muslim Council of Britain, and the government lets them have their way because they're scared of losing the Muslim vote. But I think there's much more going on here. For instance, at one point in the interview with Nick Griffin, he says that the Syrian religious community actually wanted to send Sufi missionaries to Britain. Now, Sufism is something entirely different. It's a particularly benign and peacefully Gnostic interpretation of Islam. In fact, you get a lot of Sufis in places like Glastonbury, and apparently this was stopped. It was killed off from on high, and why, I don't know. But I mean, it seems that MI6 were particularly involved with this. How Nick Griffin knows about what MI6 is up to is a question you'll have to ask him. But I think it's much more likely in this case that the Wahhabist presence in the UK has been deliberately engineered by the government. And this is why you get these Wahhabist clerics in the mosques which are radicalising the youth. And as I've explained, a lot of these people, it's likely that they are intelligence agencies working for the British government. Why? Well, it's because they want, as I said at the start of this section, the Muslims are the new Jews. What they'll do is, along with this radicalisation, these radical clerics, along with false flag terror attacks and things like that, they want to stir up the people of this country into a civil war. By doing that, they can then bring in the big brother state. They can say, okay, things are so bad, we've got to do something. As David Icke calls it, problem, reaction, solution. The problem is this fighting on the streets, bombings, attacks, and all these other things. That, you know, the EDL and Al-Muhajirun are not just involved; the mainstream media is as well. After the sort of state of emergency has been declared, the government can bring in tougher and tougher laws, regulations. For instance, ID cards, things like this. More and more CCTV. And this will affect, of course, may have many, many other agendas behind it, including our relation to the rest of the world, international politics, things like that. So, what I've said about Syria, you know, is related to what I'm talking about here. There's a scam being played on us, all right, and it needs to be exposed, both internationally and within this country. We do need to expose it, and we need to expose it now.
From extraterrestrials to exposing the truth, this is Planet X.
Right, now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Bradley Manning. This is another major news story that's been very much in our faces over the last couple of weeks. Bradley Manning apparently is now called Chelsea Manning, and he's now a she. Describes himself as a her, she, and says that he or she is now a woman. So in other words, he has feelings of transgender. This is what the media is now focusing on. I personally don't think it's relevant. I think that he or she, Chelsea or Bradley, is someone I admire very much. I think they are a real hero. I mean, you hear a lot about heroes nowadays when it comes to the armed forces. In fact, you can't open a copy of The Sun without seeing the word in bold capital letters leaping out of you. Usually it's next to a photograph of a young man in uniform who's just been killed in this war in Afghanistan, which, as I've explained, has got nothing to do with liberation or democracy. It's all about the oil industry. It's all about geopolitics and about benefiting those in power. Bradley Manning has been sentenced. He had a court-martial and was sentenced to 35 years in jail for espionage. And what did he do? That's the question. What did he do? Well, Bradley Manning was in Iraq, and he came across an attempted cover-up by the US government, and he decided that it was something that shouldn't be covered up, so he sent it to WikiLeaks. Now, if he had been a good little robot and just stood at attention and said, "Sir, yes, sir," and did his duty by keeping his mouth shut, I'm sure he would have a medal by now. But he decided to speak out. Now, what it was, I think, people said, well, what was it he was describing? Well, it was a sense of righteous indignation, because what happened was, there was an incident in which some helicopter pilots flying over Baghdad saw a group of men on the ground, and they thought they were terrorists. These men were carrying what they thought were rifles and rocket launchers, and so they shot them from the helicopter. And there's a very gruesome film of this, which, of course, because it went to WikiLeaks, you can all see it. If it hadn't, no one would ever see this film if it hadn't been for Bradley Manning. Unfortunately, afterwards, it turned out that these were actually not terrorists. What they were journalists. And they weren't carrying weapons at all. They were carrying mobile phones and cameras. Now, by rights, there should have been a full inquiry into this. There should have been a complete inquest, a full investigation, and no doubt the American government would have had to compensate the victims of this blunder. But instead, they tried to cover it up. And it's thanks to Bradley Manning that they didn't succeed. Now, this actually has a this actually has a precedent, because I'm sure you may be familiar with David Shayler, who is somebody who, like Bradley Manning, he has feelings of transgenderism in him as well. But again, I think that's irrelevant. I don't care about his personal life. I care about what he's done. David Shayler was an MI5 agent who discovered that the UK government was funding terrorists in Libya, anti-government terrorists. And he said he came forward into the newspapers and he talked about it. And the newspapers never actually said what he was trying to expose. They just said, An MI5 agent has broken his security oath. And basically they treated him like he was a traitor. And they even interviewed people afterwards, and they said, "Hey, put him in the tower. Put him in the tower for betraying his country." And these idiots didn't even know why he'd done it. They didn't even ask why he'd done it. And I mean, with Bradley Manning, it's slightly better actually, because there was slightly more and more people are sort of like questioning the official line than they did with David Shayler. Now, David Shayler has actually been proven right, because I mean, if you look at Libya now, since the war last year, the very, very same people that the UK government was funding and arming all those years ago are now running the damn country. They've killed Gaddafi. They've taken over. So, well, the cruel irony, isn't it? The cruel irony. Michael Elner was right. Everything's backwards. Everything's upside down. If Bradley Manning could have been a good soldier by keeping his mouth shut, keeping his when he sees things like this going on, just keeping quiet about it, and he'd get a medal. He'd have been taken when he went home. He would be paraded through his hometown as a hero. Yet he disobeys orders and breaches security as an act of conscience, which I think makes him a real man. I think that's what makes you a real hero. But how come there are no people in shopping centres with collecting tins trying to help him? He gets 35 over the wall for an act of decency in the face of extreme adversity. I mean, I forgot who it was who said this, but I think it's true. A man will face an army rather than the scorn of his peers. I can't remember who that quote comes from, but I think it's very, very true. And the people guilty of the crime he's exposed, they're still sitting there in their cosy offices. They're still in front of the TV cameras, telling people they can trust them. They're immune from criticism. They're above the law. And right now, these are the same people who were behind the cover-up, or the attempted cover-up of this incident in Baghdad, are the people telling us that we've got to go and bomb Syria. I expect they're going to be blowing up many more innocent people in Syria, and then the very same thing will happen. There'll be cover-ups. All I can do is hope that if any of those squaddies in Syria who end up there see something like Manning did, I hope they will be as brave as doing what he did. I think they're trying to make an example of Bradley Manning, actually, a warning to all other personnel not to speak out like he did. I think they're sending a message to all the servicemen who are still active and still keeping these secrets. But like I said, I feel there is hope here. I mean, he's in a better position, it appears, than David Shayler was. There's a lot of public support for him. His legal team are already launching an appeal. And it fills me with hope. In fact, he's even been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by someone called Brigitte Jonsdottir, who is a member of the Parliament of Iceland. So the powers that be have succeeded in convicting Bradley Manning, but are they really going to make this conviction stick? I doubt it. I feel hopeful. I think we're going to see Bradley Manning out of jail. I really do.
You're listening to Planet X. Planet X, the biggest paranormal show on radio.
And now it's that time again. Our regular little slot here on the Ben Emlyn-Jones Show, Planet X Radio. It's space weather. Yes, indeed. Right, well, we have a waning gibbous moon at the moment, which means it's slightly more than half, if you know what you mean by gibbous. It's a moon between half and full. And it's actually almost half, because tomorrow night it will be half. It's rising at 10:47 p.m. and it's setting at 1:47. So it's rising at 10:47 p.m. and setting at 1:47 p.m. tomorrow. So it's up for a nice long time. Plenty of time to watch it. Sunrise 6:11 a.m. Sunset 8:05 p.m. So this depends on where you're living, of course. I always pick a random spot in the middle of in Midlands, England. But if you live further north, the sunrise will be earlier and the sunset later. If you live further south, it'll be the opposite: sunrise later and sunset earlier. Of course, if you live in other parts of the world, because I know Planet X Live has an international audience, it'll be different again. So, sorry, I'm not sort of like being Midlands Englandish. I'm just doing this for convenience, I suppose. But basically, what I'm saying is, this gives you an idea generally what's happening. And that is that the summer is drawing in. It's not quite midsummer yet. It's descending towards autumn, although the weather outside today is fairly fine, as it has been for the last few days. Sunspots. Right, we have a sunspot called AR 1835 in the western equatorial region of the disk, and AR 1836 very close by, slightly smaller. The first one is actually quite large and could cause trouble. Spotless days 0. Now, what I'll have to do, I think, is to talk to you a little bit more, maybe on a future show, about the ideas of Mangia Samantha Lawton, who's a very interesting lady. So she's someone I've been speaking to about sunspots and other things, and about what they might really be, because, you know, conventionally they're supposedly a patch of cool plasma on the sun's surface, but Mangia thinks they may be something very different. It's a big subject. I'll have to go into it in more detail later. The solar flare trace, well, it carried on. It was quite choppy all weekend. This line which represents X-ray activity in the sun, but there were no major flares at all. But there were multiple small ones, and by the weekend it went completely still. Absolutely nothing, and the baseline just descended down to its usual location in the mid-B range, because solar flares are categorized according to their range, which is A, B, C, M and X, and B is quite low. It's one range above the bottom. But there has been a coronal hole in the sun, which is to do with the sun's magnetic atmosphere. This corona around the sun, which is only visible from Earth during eclipses. But the magnetic fields in the sun's northern hemisphere have opened up, creating a hole in the sun's upper atmosphere. On August the 27th, solar wind is streaming out of the coronal hole and heading to the Earth, which is due to arrive on August the 30th and 31st, which I believe is Friday and Saturday. Its impact will not be a major event. Nevertheless, it could spark minor geomagnetic storms and auroras at high latitudes. This is good news for the Arctic Circle, where the midnight sun is setting. Darkening skies will allow auroras to be seen for the first time in months. And that basically means, this means that if you live near the north, or indeed if you might even be in Antarctica right now listening to this program. If that's the case, then that's good news, because you'll see this beautiful aurora above the Earth, which is these beautiful lights in the sky. On the subject of geomagnetic storms, mid latitudes we have an activity 10% level of activity, 1% chance of a minor storm, and 1% chance of a severe storm. The higher latitudes we have a potential activity of 15%, 25% chance of a minor storm, and severe chance 20%. So it's gone up a little bit in the last few days. Well, it's not as high. I think last week it was slightly higher because of those big flares, but flares, God bless, it's like an ABBA concert here, isn't it? Because of these solar flares, the chances, you see, this is a prediction, it's not a record, so because we're expecting this solar wind from the coronal hole, we might actually end up with some geomagnetic storms by the weekend. Right, near-Earth asteroids. We had 2013 QR1 go past, an asteroid which is 754 feet across, but it was 8.2 lunar distances away, so that's a long way. It's over 2 million miles. It's over 8 times 8 lunar distance is the distance on average of the moon to the Earth. So 8.2 lunar distances means it's 8.2 times as far as the moon is from the Earth. So that's a long way. But we've had some pink liners, which means they're within 5 lunar distances of the Earth. 2001 AV43 and 2013 NJ. They are 2.9 and 2.5 lunar distance respectively. 2001 AV43 is only 190.3 feet across. But 2013 NJ is bigger, it's 590 feet. So it's a big fella, like a big flying boulder, or maybe like a hill or mountain flying through the sky. Well, those aren't going to come past anyway until the 18th and the 26th of November, so they won't be here for a while. But their trajectory has been tracked, and we know they're not going to come anywhere near the Earth. Well, 2002 JR9 is coming by on Saturday, which is 63.5 lunar distances away. And that's big. That's 4,593 feet across, which is over 3/4 of a mile in diameter. But as it's 63.5 lunar distances, is a very long way indeed. September the 21st, we've got 2013 PX6, which is 3,281 feet across. That's pretty big. As you can tell by its name, it's only just been discovered. This year. But it is a long way away. 68.6 lunar distances at its closest point of approach. And there's going to be none closer that have been found yet in the next couple of months. And as I've explained before, this is not a bigger danger as you might think in, the movies like Armageddon, Deep Impact, make you think that it's a very serious risk. But actually, there are, most of the big asteroids have now been tracked, and none of them are coming anywhere near the Earth for hundreds of years. As I said before, if we do find one out there with our name on it, there are ways and means of knocking it onto a different course, which I'll go into in a future program. Solar wind speed 242.8 miles per second. Density 68.838 particles per cubic inch. So this is one of the densest solar winds I've ever seen, and I've been doing space weather for over a year because I've been doing it on my CMR show as well. That's probably due to this coronal hole, I'm guessing. If there are any space weather experts among my listeners, please do let me know if I'm correct there. Well, that was the space weather this week. So, thank you very much for listening. I hope you find that useful. As I've said, space weather is anything out there that affects life down here. And that's quite a lot, more than you might think. Well, I want to thank you all for listening. This has been the third programme of the Ben Emlyn-Jones Show on Planet X Live. Do stay tuned because there will be another show coming after this one, probably a recorded one from previous broadcasts. But do check out the various live broadcasts. There's the Tony Topping Show on Tuesday evenings at 8 PM and the Darren Perks Show on Thursday evenings at 8 PM, and of course the main Planet X radio programme on Sunday evenings. And of course, if you do miss one, don't worry, because I said they are played throughout the week. And also go to the Planet Xtra YouTube channel where you get podcasts of all the programmes. So that's it for this week. I will be keeping my eyes and ears peeled and perked up for anything interesting that might come my way, things that might get my goat, or just things I think should be reported anyway. Hopefully next week I'll have some good news for you as well as bad news, because of course there is a lot of bad news in the world today. But don't give up. I do believe that things will turn our way eventually if we keep speaking out, keep letting everyone know. As I said, take this information that I give you on this program and turn it into action. Don't just sit at home and think about it and say nothing. Speak out. Come out of the closet as a conspiracy theorist. Hello everyone, my name's Ben and I'm a conspiracy theorist. You know what I mean? You may be surprised how many other people are secretly thinking the same things that you do. And when enough people are talking about it, that's when the world changes. And I look forward to that very much. And I look forward to sharing the experience of watching it changed with you and everyone else at Planet X Live. Because I tell you what, it's fun. As David Icke says, it's a great time to be alive. Well, thank you for listening and have a pleasant evening. See you again soon. So stay where you are sitting and do not touch your dials. My name is Ben Emlyn-Jones and I am the host of the Ben Emlyn-Jones Show, and I'm best described... How do I describe myself? I kind of like Jeff Rents without the hair. You got that picture in your head? That's it, yeah. Anyway, anyone who listened to my show last night on Critical Mass Radio, I'm sorry about the big mess up, the technical problems and things like that. I did have to abort the show. It's a long story, but basically, just to avoid anyone panicking, you know, I will be back next week. I'm sure it's just a one-off and I can get it fixed. So, sorry about all that. Anyway, we've got an awful lot on tonight's programme, so let us proceed.
You're listening to Planet X. Planet X, the biggest paranormal show on radio.
Right, well, on the subject of what's got my goat this week, quite a lot actually. Where shall I start? Well, something that's happening today is very, very important to start with, because it's actually 50 years ago today, the 28th of August, 1963, that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood up at a rally in Washington, D.C., and he made this very passionate and poetic speech, whose refrain was, "I have a dream," and he goes on to describe what his dream is. And his dream relates to the fact that in those days, in many parts of the United States, they had a very, very similar racial classification and segregation system to South Africa in the apartheid era. Black people were officially designated as the social inferiors.
This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill.
Do not be afraid. We are now in control of what you hear.
1, 2, 3, testing.
A journey to the far reaches of knowledge and the unknown.
I can't believe I just saw that.
From aliens to angels, conspiracies to cover-ups.
One soul and preeminent power.
From extraterrestrials to exposing the truth.
I'll try and explain as much as I can.
You're listening to Planet X.
You're listening to Planet X.
Planet X. Planet X. Online. On your mobile.
This is the Planet X Network. And stay tuned for the Ben Emlyn-Jones Show. It's coming up next.
Welcome to the Ben Emlyn-Jones Show on Planet X Radio. Tune in for all the latest news, views and reviews from the world of government cover-ups, ghosts, UFOs, paranormal investigation, hidden knowledge, forbidden history and archaeology, chemtrails and hospital porters. The date is Wednesday, August the 28th and the time is 8 p.m. The Ben Emlyn-Jones Show is now on the air. Actually, by the time you listen to this programme, it will probably be underway. I have to say I'm disgusted by this, and I consider it an insult to the memory of Martin Luther King. And this is not the first time that Obama has tried to falsely leech off the legacy of Martin Luther King. He was actually inaugurated on Martin Luther King's birthday, and that was not an accident. He did it on purpose. And what he's trying to do is he's trying to associate himself with Martin Luther King, his own identity with King's, in order to gain support. Now Barack Obama, of course, is a black man. He's the same colour as Martin Luther King, but in all other ways they couldn't be more different. Barack Obama is not a man of peace. In fact, he sends drones into Pakistan to mow down innocent bystanders. Far from fighting racism, Obama is best buddies and canoodles regularly at business dinners and other events with people who want to wipe out all natural human races and replace us with genetically modified transhumanist monsters. Less than 500 million of us as well. Martin Luther King comes across as very, very sincere, and you can see he's sincere. He paid an awful price for what he did. Obama sheds crocodile tears, very transparently actually, when he hears about school shootings. Now, I get sick and tired of hearing about America's first black president. It's giving a deluded impression, you see. It's saying, well, Obama has to be an anti-establishment figure just because he's black. And of course, black people have always been on the receiving end of white people. And this designation took its form in hundreds of different ways, to, having all the worst housing in town, having to use separate toilets that are all dirty and horrible, and the white ones were much nicer, to having to sit at the back of buses, things like that. Understandably, the black people hated this, and there was a backlash against it, and some of this backlash took the form of violence. There were people standing up calling for all-out war and even genocide against the white population in the United States. But into this melting pot of rage emerged a man of peace, a man preaching non-violent resistance, in a very similar way to Mahatma Gandhi had done in India a couple of decades earlier. He was a spiritual man as well as a politician, and he immediately got an audience for his words. Unlike so many others, Martin Luther King understood the simple fact that hatred begets only more hatred, and he always stressed it was important to avoid the temptation of hatred. In 1968 he was shot dead by an even more obvious government conspiracy than that of John F. Kennedy's assassination. But you can get a video of the speech. It's lovely to listen to. It's about 7 minutes. It's on YouTube. Anyway, to mark this occasion, the current US President, Barack Obama, is going to make a speech himself, and he's going to make it from the same spot as Martin Luther King did 50 years ago to the day at this special rally to commemorate the event. It's probably going on by now, actually. The end of all this abuse for so long, so Obama's obviously on the side of the common man. But God grief, they've got to realise, right? All empires and oppressive regimes have done this, right? All of them. What they do is they fool their conquered subjects by withdrawing overt power, and then they replace it with someone else who's an apparent man of the people. He's one of the conquered people, and they put him into governance instead of one of the empire's own people. But of course, he's a completely controlled puppet. Now, the Roman Empire did this, and the Spanish and British empires did this, and now the American Empire is doing it. It's the oldest trick in the book. And Alex Jones has made a really good film called The Obama Deception that goes into this in more detail. I really do hope Americans are not going to fall for this again. Now, Barack Obama he comes across as this man of the people, but he is a tool of the Illuminati global elite, every bit as much as any other head of government, every bit as much as George Bush. Only I think Obama is far more dangerous than Bush. I wish Bush was still president, I really do, because Bernard, everyone knew Bush was a brainless maniac, but Obama has this veneer of credibility, and his deceit is actually far more ambitious too, because there's a lot about his personal background which is very obscure. For instance, he has a birth certificate which is a bit questionable, and also the journalists have had trouble trying to track down his old classmates at university. All the people that went